lecture. Sorry, we're going to finish chapter 6, part 1, and then we'll move to part 2, because we didn't quite finish on Wednesday. Just FYI, I am posting the midterm exam online on Wednesday. It's short essay, open book, open note, and you'll have a week to do it. Okay. So we ended last time by talking a bit about the qualifications, both formal and informal, of the state legislature. We'll finish talking a bit about leadership today, and then we'll move on to discussing how legislation gets passed or not in our state legislature. Okay, so our lieutenant governor, it's unique in Texas in that they run independently of the governor. In most states, they run on the same ticket. You would elect the governor and the lieutenant governor at the same time, on the same ticket. Here, it's a separate election. It's governor and then the lieutenant governor is separate. So that means they're not as tied to the governor. They don't owe the governor for becoming lieutenant governor. It also means, hypothetically, at some point, we could have a governor who's a Republican and a lieutenant governor who's a Democrat. We could have a divided governor's office. The lieutenant governor is the president of the Senate, and their role is largely legislative. So they're there to help control the flow of legislation, to keep the legislatures moving when they're in session, because it's such a short session, they need to get going. But they aren't immune to party pressure. They aren't immune to issues from other members of their party. We had a lieutenant governor who decided he wanted to run for the National Senate and moved to the right and ended up taking off the Democrats, more moderate Republicans. And then he lost his party's primary because they ticked off so many people. So they're not immune to political pressure, to party pressure. But they are separate of the governor, so they don't face the same pressure to do exactly what the governor wants. They can kind of pursue their own agenda. In terms of the leadership, like the National Congress, we do have a Speaker of the House and a President pro tempore of the Senate. So the state Speaker of the House is chosen through a simple majority vote. Usually they're chosen by the majority party. So not only do they have to campaign to win their House seat, they also have to get the support of their fellow House members. There's a lot of politicking, a lot of, if you back me, I'll support your legislative agenda. I promise to work on X, Y, Z. Also, if someone's choosing to run again for speaker, then the other members need to know so they don't say, oh, I want to run for speaker and then run into a conflict or challenge someone who can't win. So there's a lot of vote trading, deal making, back and forth over who's going to be the Speaker of the House. And there's no term limits. As long as they're in the state legislature, they can continue to be the Speaker. Usually, there's only a change if, let's say, Democrats took over control of the state House, or the Speaker chose not to run for re-election or lost re-election. And unfortunately, it can get ugly sometimes, and this was the case with the former Speaker, Joe Strauss. He was seen as fairly popular by both parties, pretty bipartisan, but he ran into trouble with the far right of the GOP. There were members of the state house who said, well, he's Jewish and we should be represented by a Christian. And of course, that caused some issues with people accusing them of anti-Semitism and all sorts of issues. So he started becoming less bipartisan and choosing to support Republicans. So he lost the bipartisan support and chose not to run for re-election in 2018. He faced so many issues with the anti-Semitism, the push from the left, the push from the right, and so he just said, enough, and left. And in the Senate, there's the president pro tempore, who's chosen to run the Senate when the lieutenant governor isn't there. So if Governor Abbott is traveling and the lieutenant governor's in charge, then whomever the Senate picks will run the Senate when the lieutenant governor can't be there, like on the national level. So it's usually someone pretty high up in the Senate with experience who's tapped to take over when the lieutenant governor can't be there for whatever reason. Did someone have a question? It's kind of ridiculous that in the 21st century people would have a problem with the idea of the Jewish Speaker of the House in Texas, but there you go. Okay, so that's the end of part 1. And now we'll switch to part 2. So we're going to talk now about legislative staff, committees, and the legislative process. Okay, so in addition to the leadership, we also, of course, have to have committees. So the first type is called a standing committee. It's a permanent committee. They exist from one legislative session to the next. It's about 34 to 40 members on the standing committees. They are dealing with policy. And usually the members are chosen based on seniority. There's also the conference committee. These are temporary. They only exist during the legislative session. So they exist to help work on the bills that are going to be different, right? The State House will introduce one version of the bill. The State Senate will introduce another. And so this committee is made up of representatives and senators who will work out the differences to create one bill that can be voted on. There's also an ad hoc committee. Again, they're temporary. They're there to work on a specific issue or problem like epidemics or education, gun laws, etc. So they look at a specific problem, they make recommendations, and then they disband. You also have the interim committees. They don't get as much attention, but they are important because they have to keep doing the work of the legislature after the session is over. They have to write up all of the laws that were passed, put together the proposed constitutional amendments, do the day-to-day work that goes on after the session ends. So not as glamorous, but still important, still necessary to keep the legislature functioning. And again, usually a committee appointment is chosen by seniority. The longer you've served in the State House or Senate, the better the committee you're going to get. Usually, though, they do try to balance the committees. If less than half of the committee has been chosen by seniority, then someone can ask to be put on a committee because they have seniority. And if there's a committee of less than 10 in the Senate, 3 of the members of that committee have to have served in the last legislative session. And if it's a committee of more than 10, then they need 4 senators from previous sessions. It's a way of keeping things on track, making sure that the legislature will function properly, that you have people with knowledge of how the committee should work, what their roles are, etc. Another important body within the legislature is the staff itself. Because the legislative sessions are short, the personal staff for the members aren't going to have enough time to do the proper research. So there's a private group called the Texas Research League that will do the studies and make the recommendations. So it's not the staff necessarily that's helping to do the research. It's this privately funded and pretty pro-business group that will do the research, come in and tell the legislators, here's how we feel you should handle this issue. And so a lot of the staff comes from a state agency or is part of the institution. So there's not as much personal staff. Personal staff are usually in the offices in their districts, not necessarily in Austin. So because they aren't tied to a specific legislator, they're not as impartial. They're not going to be telling their specific representative or senator, here's what your constituents want. So there's a lot of overdependence on private groups, a lot of relying on state agencies, interest groups in some ways to help them with the research. And a lot of the research, or a lot of the staff work gets done by the Legislative Budget Board. So it's also a bit different because in most states, a state representative or a state senator will have their own personal staff. Here, they don't really. What staff they do have is either in their district office or there to handle things like phone calls and drop-ins, but not necessarily the research and other parts that we would see in a different state. Okay, so one of the main legislative staff services is the Legislative Budget Board. It's a 10-member House and Senate committee that basically is always in operation. And they're in charge of approving the budget requests. So they help to work on the budget. So right now, they are looking at what funding is available and how we'd allocate funding for when the legislature meets in January of next year. And they do work closely with state agencies, and state agencies are trying to get money, of course, right? They want more money for education. or the environment, or public transit. So they're currently looking at the budget and putting together some information that will help when the legislators come back in January. There's also the Legislative Council. It has 14 members. They do put the bills together during the session. Again, the individual legislators don't have enough time to write their own bills, so the council does it for them. They're also in charge of helping to investigate state agencies. If they find some irregularities with funding or problems with leadership, they're going to look into that. They'll look at problems that they think the legislature should tackle and put together recommendations for the next legislative session. Now, obviously, this is a lot of work that they have to do, but they are chronically underfunded. They're never given enough funding to do full-time bill drafting and research services. So they're trying to provide as much help as they can, but they never have enough money to be able to fully fund this research and bill drafting. So they try to keep up with the demand, but it's a little tricky. You also have the Legislative Audit Committee, which includes the chairpersons for Senate Finance, House Ways and Means, House Appropriations, and the Senate State Affairs Committee. This also mirrors the National Congress. On the national level, we also have House Ways and Means, etc. So what this committee does is it checks to make sure the agencies are spending the money properly. That if you give the Parks and Wildlife Services Department a budget of $50 million, you want to make sure the money is going where it's supposed to. That it's being spent on preservation, cleanup, personnel, and not office parties or purchasing unnecessary equipment. So it's a way of trying to keep the agencies in check, making sure the money goes where it's supposed to and isn't being mismanaged. Okay, so while the officers do have a fair amount of power, obviously they're going to face limits. Um, their personality can be an issue. If they're the type to say, do what I say or else, they're not going to get a lot of cooperation from the legislators. But if they are interested in running for higher office, governor, um, National House of Representatives, National Senate, they're going to try to um, avoid ticking anyone off. They're not going to want to tick off the special interests that will give them funding, and they're not going to tick off their fellow legislators who could give them their endorsement and their backing. But part of it depends on if they have ambitions for higher office and how good they work with others. If they're not good at working with others, they're not going to last very long. Also, the legislators will go along with the leadership, but they also want to be able to act independently for their district. So they may say to the Speaker of the House, okay, I'll support this bill, but when I introduce this bill for my district, you have to promise to support it. So they can put some limits on their power by negotiating, reminding them that the only reason they're in charge is because of their fellow legislators. There's also interest groups, of course. Interest groups are always going to come into play. Environmental groups, oil interests, companies like Tesla, they're all going to play a role in policy making through lobbying, campaign contributions, and so on. And the governor does have some influence over the state legislature. Their veto power is almost absolute. Usually, because the legislative session is so short, the legislators are already out of session by the time the governor gets the bill, so he can veto it, and there's not much the legislature can do about it. They can also threaten a special session and say, if you guys don't get this highway bill sorted out, I'll call you back in and make you do it. And sometimes the power is abused. Governor Perry rightly used the special session for redistricting, but he abused it when he said we need to have a special session on abortion and highway funding. And then, of course, there's us, the constituents. We're not necessarily interested in what's happening in the legislature, but sometimes we can force them to take action. Sometimes we can push back. When Governor Perry ordered all sixth grade girls in public schools to receive the HPV vaccines, the religious right pushed back and said that would be encouraging promiscuity, and got the state legislature to override that order, to say, no, you're not allowed to do this. And Governor Perry, at the end of last week, issued an order limiting ballot drop-off places to one per county. There's been a lot of pushback and accusations of voter suppression. So this will very likely end up before the courts, and of course there's a lot of people who are unhappy with this decision. So it doesn't make sense to have one drop-off location per county. Some counties are huge. How would you ever get to their drop-off location? Okay, any questions? Anything you need clarification on? Good. Okay. All right. So now we get into the process of how exactly do we create our laws. There's three types of resolutions. The first is called a simple resolution, and that's basically housekeeping, taking care of things like wishing someone in the state legislature a happy birthday, or clarifying the floor schedule, things like that. A concurrent one is where both houses are required to take action, like when they want to adjourn the legislature. Both chambers have to agree on adjournment. And then a joint resolution is one like introducing constitutional amendments. It has to go through both chambers. It has to be passed by both chambers. So that's how we get our constitutional amendments proposed. Now, bills can originate in either chamber except for revenue bills. Only the House can introduce a spending bill. And again, this is modeled on the federal system. So we give the State House of Representatives control over the introduction of spending bills. In each legislative session, there are over 7,000 bills introduced, but only about 20 to 30% actually get passed. And this number does go down when there's redistricting for reapportionment. So in 2021, we may not see as much in the way of bills being passed because they are going to have to deal with reapportionment and redistricting because of the latest census. And it's a multi-step process to get bills through the legislative session, and we will break down those steps. Okay, so there's two ways to introduce a bill. The first is for a member to introduce it on the floor of the Senate after they get recognized by the Lieutenant Governor, or they can give a copy of the bill to a Senate Secretary or House Clerk. It gets assigned a number. Then the clerk gives it the first 3 readings required, and then it can be introduced. And legislation can only be introduced in the first 60 days. Considering the session is only 140 days, after that, you'd run out of time to properly discuss, debate, or amend that piece of legislation. So members essentially have to be ready to go. They have to have their bill drafted and ready for introduction pretty much immediately after they get to Austin. And then once it is introduced, it's up to the Lieutenant Governor or the Speaker of the House to decide which committee will look at the bill, which committee will discuss it. And there's 5 factors that they take into consideration. First off is the positions of their own financial supporters and backers, right? Would this bill cause trouble for me in terms of re-election? Second, what effect it will have on other legislation, especially funding, right? How much money is this going to cost? Where would it come from? How would we pay for it? Third, their own ideological commitment to the bill. Is this something they agree with? Maybe, maybe not. Also, the past record of support or not from the bill's backer. Is this something that they've been talking about for a long time? Do they have support for this? And also, are they willing to bargain? If they're willing to be flexible and negotiate a little bit more, then there's better odds that it will actually get assigned to a committee and not just killed by the leadership. All right, so once it gets to a committee, then a lot of the back and forth begins. We have the bill sponsor trying to keep it from being put at the bottom of the pile. The further down the agenda it is, the less likelihood that it will be discussed in that legislative session, and less likely that it will be passed. They also don't necessarily want the committee to significantly change their bill. If you introduce a bill that says we need to spend more money on the environment, and it becomes a bill that gives more protections to the oil industry, well, you pretty much lost the thread of it. And the committees will hold hearings on the bill that the public is allowed to attend. The media will be there if it's a very contentious piece of legislation. Also for special interests. Sometimes they'll hold a hearing at 11 p.m. If it's something that the public doesn't really care about, they'll schedule it for an odd hour. But if it's something they think people are really going to want to pay attention to, they might schedule it for 5 or 6 p.m. in the evening. There's also the ability for a senator to tag a bill. If a senator is not given notice that there's a hearing, or it hasn't been posted publicly 72 hours in advance, they can place a tag on it and say, look, you have to give 48 hours written notice, so they can delay a hearing. They can say, you know what, I didn't hear about this in time, so we need to delay the discussion on this bill. And then the committee has the choice to report the bill favorably, unfavorably, or not say anything at all. And if they do give it an unfavorable or no report, then it's dead. It's dead, stick a fork in it, it's not coming out of that session. It can try to be reintroduced, but it's basically dead. Okay, so if it gets through the committee, it then has to go to the floor of the House or the Senate. If it's put on the schedule for debate, but in the Senate, that calendar's not necessarily followed. If it's something that the Senate feels they need to take into consideration out of order, then you need a 2/3 majority vote. Basically, they can say, look, this has to be taken care of now, it's very critical. And usually they'll make sure that the lieutenant governor tells them, you'll have the support for this to be considered out of order. Then there's a second reading that's considered necessary. If there's no second reading within 72 hours of the legislature adjourning, the bill is dead. So after the second reading, it then goes to the floor for debate. And all you need is a simple majority. You really don't need you don't need a 2/3 majority on most of it. You just need a simple majority to say yes. And like their counterparts on the national level, Our state senators do have the power to filibuster, to basically go on the floor of the state senate and talk about whatever they want to kill a piece of legislation. Now, it's rare because of the short time to consider legislation, and usually the senator has to let the press know there's going to be a filibuster. But it does happen. And the longest filibuster was 43 hours in the 1970s. During a filibuster, you are not allowed to sit down. You are not allowed to go to the bathroom. You're not allowed to eat anything. If you stop talking, if you sit down, the filibuster is over. So you have to want it. In 2013, Wendy Davis filibustered for 11 hours to kill a bill that would restrict abortion, and she got a lot of national attention. And she came prepared. She was wearing sneakers. I think she had a diaper or something, just so she was prepared, because she was going to be up there for a while, and you can't go to the bathroom. You cannot leave the floor. So you have to want it, and you have to want it pretty bad. And then if the bill originates from the Senate, they have to go back through those first three steps: the scheduling, the reading, and the debate. But they can't consider a Senate bill after the first 135 days of the regular session, unless it's something like overriding a veto. So they're pretty strictly regulated on how much time they have to debate and how much they want to consider filibustering a particular piece of legislation. Okay, so with the conference committee, obviously, if you have two different versions of a bill, then you have to combine them to create one single bill. So it's 5 members from the House and 5 from the House, 5 from the Senate, who are appointed by the Speaker and either the Lieutenant Governor or the President pro tempore. And so what they do is they look at the differences between the two bills. And they can amend the bill, or they can significantly rewrite it. So they're taking two bills and packaging them into one. So they'll discuss it. Special interests will get involved to try and keep something in a bill or add something to it, arrange some kind of trade-off, negotiation. So there's a lot of politicking involved. They face pressure from other members of the legislature, from the public, from special interests. And once they're done rewriting, reconfiguring the bill into one proposed legislation, it goes back to the state House and the state Senate for a vote. And that's when they can choose to accept it, and thus it becomes law, reject it, or send it back to the committee. So no bill can be introduced twice in the same section, but if its sponsor significantly rewrites it, it can be introduced as new legislation. But usually they only get one crack at it. And if the committee rejects it, or the members of the State House and Senate reject it, that's pretty much the end of it for that session. Okay, so if the bill is passed, it then goes to the governor, right? And the governor has 10 days to take action. Now that 10 days does not include Sundays. So it's 10 days, but not counting a Sunday. He or she also, if the legislature is adjourned, they actually have 20 days to take action. So the governor has a couple of options. He can sign it, making it law. He can veto the bill. Or he can use essentially what's kind of a passive form of acceptance. If he doesn't sign it, then the bill becomes law after 10 days or 20, again, if the legislature is not in session. And the governor will use this if they oppose the bill, but they don't want to tick off their constituents or special interests, or they don't want the veto to be overridden. So if they're basically like, I don't support this, but I don't want to tick off the people of Texas before an election, they'll just let it passively become law. So that they didn't support it, but that they're not going to veto. And so the veto can be very useful at the end of the session. If the legislature has adjourned, they can't come back and override the veto. So they're going to try to make sure they leave enough time for the governor to sign a bill, but give them the ability to try and override the veto. To override the veto, you would need a 2/3 majority vote in each chamber. It's not impossible, it's just highly difficult. The governor also has the power of what's called a line item veto. In an appropriations bill, the governor can choose to remove an item and say, I'm approving the budget, but I'm not approving extra funding for childcare, etc. So to get around this item veto, the state legislature has started doing things like giving a lump sum of money to colleges and universities, saying the UT system gets $50 million without putting in where each part of the budget goes. So they'll try to limit it by saying it's all or nothing. Either they get the funding or they don't, and if they don't, then you have a real problem on your hands. Okay, so our legislature is unique, to put it mildly. Obviously, it doesn't help that it's a 140-day session every other year. There's not enough time to look at the legislation. They only have 140 days to read proposed legislation, create their own legislation, attend committee hearings, and talk to their constituents and interest groups. So there's just not enough time for them to really read through the bill. They have to do a surface level look at it and say yes or no. So there's just not time. Of course, there's always going to be an overlap between what their constituents want and what their interest groups want. Constituents may want tougher environmental regulations, but oil companies may oppose that. And then the question becomes, of course, who wins, right? Do the people win or do the interest groups win? And there's always a fight over who's getting funding. There's always more programs seeking money than there is money. Because we don't have a state income tax, our budget is pretty limited. So there's always a fight over who's getting funding, what groups, what agencies, what interests. And you see people fighting over it for economic or moral reasons. And you see a lot of vote trading, bargaining, negotiating, things like, I'll support funding for more highways if you help me pass a law that would put stricter regulations on who can work in nursing homes. A lot of back and forth trading with other members. And the legislators, of course, have to satisfy both their campaign supporters and the lobbyists, which is a lot easier said than done. On the one hand, you don't want to tick off the people who fund your campaign. On the other hand, if your constituents get angry enough, you may not have a job. So it's often a fight between who's going to win, right? Is it going to be the people or is it going to be the financial supporters? We also have problems with the fact that the legislature has become a lot more hyper-partisan. There's not as much bipartisan support. We tend to see differences between representatives from more urban areas and more rural areas, liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican. The Senate sometimes will look at things through a moral lens, but the House tends to look at the individualistic culture. So we see this difference based on partisanship, but we tend to see more cooperation in the Senate because it's smaller and less cooperation in the House. So there's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of issues with special interests, what the constituents get, and the fact that it really doesn't make sense in a way to have our legislators meeting every other year. In 2019, they created a budget that was based on a very good economy. And then COVID-19 hit, right? So now that money's not there. So they're planning a budget for 2 years when anything can happen. And it did, right? Nobody was expecting a global pandemic in 2019, and yet here we are. So the fact that they only meet every other year makes it harder to deal with these kinds of situations. Okay, we have a couple more slides, but we're running out of time, and I don't want to go over. So we'll end here. We'll finish up the last couple of slides on Wednesday. We'll also talk about some of the laws that got passed in the last legislative session, what they did, what they do, that kind of thing. Again, I will be posting the midterm exam in Blackboard on Wednesday. You'll have a week to do it. It'll be due on the 14th by 11:59 p.m. It's open book, open note, short essay. If you use something other than the book for your notes, make sure you cite it somewhere in the exam so I can see where you got the information. You'll write about a page to a page and a half per question, double-spaced. Prefer Times New Roman, but I'm not going to be that picky about it. Any type of citation style is fine. It will go through Safe Assign, which is basically a plagiarism check. You'll have 2 attempts, so if you upload it and you're like, wow, that score's high, let me double check it, you can check your exam and resubmit it. Just making sure people don't copy and paste directly from Wikipedia into the exam. Not that anybody would do that, of course, but just in case. Also, I've had in the past a couple of incidences where students either shared answers with each other or turned in answers that were close enough that I could tell they wrote them together. If you do that, you're going to lose all of the points on the question. It's not a group exam, right? I can't stop you from accidentally bumping into each other at Starbucks, but don't be like, you do question 1 and 2, I'll do 3 and 4, and we'll switch, right? It's not a group exam. Any questions on the exam? Okay. So again, we'll finish up the legislature on Wednesday. So basically just go over the notes. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next